gardening. That's what we're going to talk about right now. The book I got by an English guy called Forest Gardening, a guy named Robert Hart. But in the last 10 years, it's become something that people have put a lot more, I'd say maybe the last 15 years now, um, people have put a lot more research and study into it. And the one thing that why people are putting more energy into it, I'm a plant guy. A lot of you guys are probably into plants in your own ways. Um, in the field of botany, the world's become a little less exciting. There's not that many people that go out and discover new plants anymore. A lot of the plants have been discovered, maybe a new algae or something. Um, so a lot of what forest gardening is discovering the relationships between the plants and everything else in the ecosystem. And so the forest gardening has really got a lot more scientific and um, a lot more like factual evidence of how it works and why it works. She's getting into your drink down
Oh,
under you.
oh, oh,
She's really getting
oh,
into it.
oh, yeah, okay.
She's thirsty. Little pea.
So part of the whole forest gardening concept, it's an ancient concept. It's something people have done thousands of years ago, but humanity on the planet, we've lived in a state of warfare for so long that we've really adapted more of an annual agricultural system. The corn and soybean system is like a result of our world being at war all the time. If you have a small village of people living somewhere and the enemy comes and burns down all your fruit and nut trees, you grab your annual crop seeds and you run to the next place and you can start over again really easily. You put your corn in, you can feed your people again really easily. Um, I can't say where the world's really in a peaceful state right now, but where we live in this part of the world, we have a lot of opportunity to put stuff in the ground and kind of have some feeling that it might be there 50 years later. Um, the other part of forest gardening that I'm really attracted to is how much more you can yield from the ground than you can from annual crops. Um, you can have, like at my place now, I'm realizing it 7 years later, how a lot of my forest gardens are starting to get to a mature place where I'm receiving a yield of food off the ground pretty much most of the year without having to put that much input into it anymore. Where the annual crops, I'm still doing the same cycle of routine work um, and getting the same yield amounts. Sometimes less, sometimes more, depends on the year. Um, so yeah, that's a basic part of how I got into forest gardening. The concept of the word forest and gardening put together, you take a forest, a wild place, and you try to figure out how the forest is naturally growing, how the humans, how we can kind of integrate into that and make it ourselves part of the ecosystem and steer succession. You guys familiar with the term succession in a forest? It's a forestry term where a grassy field, if left alone, will eventually turn into a forest. So how can we take that energy and steer it into a forest that's providing more food for people? Um, so that's some more of that concept there. Um, at this point, anybody have any comments on that?
Is that kind of like what you used to do or used to talk about as far as permaculture thing, or is forest
It's
gardening?
forest gardening is I'll talk about it a lot with
Okay.
the permaculture approach.
Okay.
Is that the same thing like foraging?
It's similar, um, but I guess with forest gardening, the reason why I like to bring it to circles is something to talk about, is because it encompasses all those things. So I see foraging as a person coming out of the house and frolicking through the forest, finding things that are there. Where a forest gardener is doing that, but they're consciously and intentionally steering the ecosystem into a state of more production so that 10 years from now, their kids can go out in the forest and it's easier to have happen. An example of that, I used to go foraging. You guys probably remember this. I'd drive all around looking for pawpaw trees from the road, and I'd park and hop out and fill up my basket. And I don't have time to do that as much anymore. But luckily, I can pull up to my parents' place, and there's trees that me and my brother planted that are 15 years old, and I can get as many as I want. And so that's me still foraging, but I intentionally planted those ones. They weren't ones that were, sprung out of the wild. The pawpaw tree is actually a good example of ancient forest gardening in our area. The pawpaw is a tree that grew with humanity. It's like part of, it needs humanity to keep it in production, basically. So in the last 10, 15 years, it's become a little bit more of a popular plant. It's become desirable, so people are planting it more.
I don't know why the window to eat them is so short.
Yeah, and they're finding more things they can do to preserve them. The big reason why people really like them, there's a lot of reasons, I guess, but one, because they're native, so they're acclimated to our area. They don't get diseases. That's a big thing I always look for when I select plants for a forest garden.
Exactly what I did.
If I can get something
I
that,
have to use poison to grow it, I won't grow it.
or if I even have to spend hours pruning it, it's like freestone, and you just pop them off. And the other thing they do is they make babies and planted them places. And they're beautiful too. Something I learned about those, actually, they used to be a rootstock plant that people would graft onto. So in the old peach orchards, the big peach orchards, they could send pruners through, and if they saw purple leaves, they would cut them off. It's kind of a clever idea, right? So a lot of the ecosystem kind of conversation, the forest garden idea, I like it because it can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. For me, I've just been into it long enough that I like it to be really complex, and I overanalyze and think about everything in a really nerdy way. There's thousands of spreadsheets out there now in the last several years that people have been putting together that are fun to look at. The concept of permaculture, that it works a lot with patterns. So I like that, bringing that into the forest garden concepts here, because you're looking at a lot of patterns in forest gardening, and you can relate it to how somebody's forest gardening. I just went to Ireland, how they're doing it there, what plants they're using there, and then kind of look at what I'm doing, and there's similar patterns. So one of the ways I talk about this forest garden, there's a lot of different ways to start in it. There's some people I know in the urban area, and they'll have thousands of volunteers and people giving them money for plants, and people dropping off loads of wood chips and all that. And it happens really quick. They can make succession happen really quick when you can put a fruit tree in that's 5 years old, and build your soil up, accelerate it 1,000 years by dumping 18 inches of topsoil and 6 inches of wood chips on top. But the part I like exploring is how you can do it on large tracts of land too, low cost. And the big part is the pattern of nitrogen fixing trees. Are you guys familiar with nitrogen fixing plants? And beans are a really common one.
Soybeans.
So there's short-term nitrogen fixers, which would be like a common bean plant that we'd put in our garden, or a clover. And then there's medium-term ones like Baptisia. It's a perennial shrubby flower, and they'll be in the ground for 5-6 years. A lot of what I'm talking about is perennial gardening. I go all over the place. I just want to reaffirm different things as I talk about them. Perennials is a big one. A lot of people don't always grasp what that fully means. A hickory tree is a perennial, and a strawberry is a perennial. But you think about the vast differences between those two. A strawberry will be perennial in one spot for 2 to 3 years, and then it's trying to walk somewhere else. Where the hickory could be somewhere for a couple hundred years. So that's like a short term and a long term. That's what I'm talking about with the nitrogen fixers as well. An annual is obviously going to be a very short term. So the big part I'm talking about with the nitrogen fixers, though, the long term one around here, an example would be the black locust trees. They're big tree. They're in the concept of succession. They're known as a pioneer tree. They're like if you leave a field to go, there'll be some of the first trees sprouting up in there. And what they're doing is they're capturing nitrogen out of the air, and it's going into the microbials in their roots. And there's different ways you can make it happen faster, but if you've ever observed black locust trees, a lot of times when they get older, chunks of them crack out and fall out onto the ground. And they're a rot-resistant wood too. So what that pattern is doing is like a fiber in the soil building, where most pioneer trees are going to be really quick rotters. They're going to rot really quickly. If you drop a tulip poplar tree on the ground, a year later it's just mush. Well, if you have a few black locust trees that are falling down in there too, they act as a fiber and hold that soil and keep it from washing away. So these are all ways in long term that we're building soil just naturally by using the patterns of nature and how nature is moving its own energy. In all plants, this is a fun nerdy thing too, all plants are accumulating something and putting it into the soil. Some of the specific ones I can think of are like dogwoods. All dogwood species are known for accumulating high amounts of calcium, and they're building the soil with, like, when the chunk of them falls off and rots and falls around the ground, it helps put calcium into the soil and make it available for the future growth. So knowing all that, one of the two things I always look at in a forest garden are the main things you're doing are mulching and harvesting, and initially seeding. So if you go out into a big field, you can let nature kind of do its own thing, but if you can collect black locust seeds and clover seeds and get them out there in high concentrations, you can steer succession in a more rapid way and get it to happen faster. And I wouldn't even bother putting fruit trees and things out there yet at all until you start having that succession happening. And there's the other part that comes in the permaculture concept is
She's going to work.
He's gotta go to work.
gotcha. The permaculture concept often talks about different zones, and it's different than your growing zone, like we're in the growing zone of 6.5 here. The zones they're talking about are more like zones of energy use. Like the home here would be like zone 1, where like way out at the end of the driveway would be closer to like zone 4 or 5. So like where you putting your energy is going to be closer to your bedroom or closer to your kitchen. So you can devote more energy to steering succession close to those areas, where the things that are further out, you can let them kind of happen a little bit more wildly. You still want to visit and do different maintenance things to them and steer it how you want. But that's just all part of designing and the mentality going into a forest garden. Depends on if you're doing 1/10 of an acre or 10 acres. If you're doing 10 acres, you kind of work closer to your house and kind of let it radiate out the energy of use that you're working. The concept of silvopasture comes in too when you're working with larger land. Silvopasture, you guys familiar with that concept?
Never heard of it.
No? It's a fun one to look into. I know that you can get grants from the NRCS for doing silvopasture. It's where you have pasture land, but you're incorporating tree growth as well. So you're mixing animals in with building a forest garden. So I don't know, it's like a pattern thing. Like you have to use fences and stuff, but you would ideally work somewhat on contour, so that when it rains, the manure in the area that pasture can go into the forest gardens, and you're not losing any of that nutrient. But what that does is it helps provide you a pathway too that you can move through. So now you're foraging, but all your growing fruit trees and nut tree crops are in an easy to harvest kind of area, and in the meantime, while they're growing, you're receiving a yield of goats or chickens or cattle or whatever you want to work with in there. And all those animals have different characteristics for sure, and how they're gonna, or how you're gonna need to barrier them between here and there. Some things really great, like I have a friend that works with pawpaw and black walnut trees, and he grazes goats right through there without any fencing. And the goats don't mess with the walnut trees or the pawpaw trees, and they eat everything else.
Hickory or pawpaw.
Yeah, they just eat everything else. And they'll clear it all out for you and keep it clean. So yeah, that's some of the fun stuff in permaculture kind of concepts in there. Some of the basic architecture of a forest garden, I want to give you guys that, because that'll give you an idea of some of what I'm talking about here too. So looking at the patterns is kind of like a lot of what I'm doing here, so you can build with whatever you want. But the basic patterns of a forest garden, there's going to be a canopy tree, and then a sub-canopy tree, and then a shrubby layer. And we as humans, this is an interesting one, we as humans are an edge species. Have you guys ever heard that concept? Like, most of the food that we get or eat is growing at the edge of a forest, or at the edge of where a forest meets grasslands, or where the forest meets the lake, or where the grassland meets the lake. There's more diversity there, so that's where a lot of our food comes from. Blackberries are a great example. They like to walk on the edge of the forest. When the forest grows in, they're moving along with the edge. There's more diversity in animal life there too. There's woodland animals and there's field animals. That's where, you know, humans have spent most of our time, is on these edge spaces. So those are the three bigger chunks. But then the other parts of this pattern here is the herbaceous layer. And the herbaceous layer are things that come up during the summer months and die back down, and you don't even see them in the winter months. Then there's ground covers. One of my favorite ones to work with around here are violets. I have to throw it out there because there's a website called plantsforafuture.org, and it's a really cool plant database there. There's over 7,000 temperate climate plants on it, and they all get ratings too. I have my own ratings of plants around here. Like the violets, I like them because you can eat the leaves. They're really great in salads or steamed. They cover the ground in a way that grasses and other weedy plants don't come up too easily. And their flowers are pretty too, of course. You can even use the roots when they get bigger and chunky, you can eat those. So yeah, the ground cover is really important too, for as the forest matures, that you have something there that's covering the ground. Another layer is a vining layer, and that's one, of course. With wild grapes, you kind of watch how they're pulling on trees and whatnot. But there's other vining layers that can be really useful, like hardy kiwis on the edge of something if it works right. And then there's the root layer. There's things like wild ramps around here, which are great to work with, or garlic, things like that. And a lot of that kind of brings me into, this is another part of what we're designing with, is we're understanding root systems of plants a lot better than we did 30 years ago. So understanding that, we can, design how different roots are working together. Some tap roots, some shrubs even, they'll just be on the surface. And if you have all plants that roots are growing on the surface, you're going to have a lot of competition there. But if you have plants of various root structures, you can tighten things up and have them closer together, more concentrated. Yeah, I think those are the basic patterns that you're working with. 1, 2, 3, 7, yeah. 7 basic patterns. So that's like a side view. And so what you can imagine, if you're expanding this kind of concept, like then you would over here have another sub-canopy tree and then a canopy tree. So when you're planting, if you're planting things out when they're young, you can kind of think about that, and then you're not planting too many canopy trees really close to each other. An old growth forest around here is really beautiful, but it's not the most productive place to go foraging. Like the pawpaw is an example I always bring up. It's one of my favorites around here, I guess. Like the native people used to girdle trees so they would die and they would get more sunlight onto their pawpaw trees. And you get a lot more fruit when they get sunlight on them. So the trees that I planted 15 years ago are out in full sun. At that time, everybody was telling me you had to plant them in the shade. They needed to be by a creek bank.
That's one place I ever seen them.
That's because the creek banks used to be the highways. So the last time people were really in the ecosystem with pawpaw trees, they were along the highway tossing seeds off to the side. Raccoons, the last couple 100 years, they were probably the main, raccoons and coyotes have been the main ones that have planted them just by eating them. And you'll see, I've seen logs in the forest and there'll be like scat with pawpaw trees sprouting out of it up in the air. It's like, I know that one doesn't have too much of a chance growing there unless that log can kind of break and then it'll grow there. They do grow as like colonies too, so they'll send out runners. So you might come across a big patch of pawpaws and they might all be one tree. So yeah, most of the things I've been discovering, they really, around here, like spice berries, they do a lot more berries on them if they have more exposure to sun. Like, so under their canopy, they'll grow fine, but they won't produce quite as high of a yield. So
What's the best?
that's one of those weird things. It's like there's that edge of creating edge. So if you're building a forest garden into an existing forest, which is a whole other concept than starting out on a grassy plain, there is going to be some tree falling that you're going to want to do. You're going to want to open some things up. At my place, I've been cutting out a lot of wild black cherries. And I love wild black cherries. They're a great fruit, but they're all like 70 feet up. So I'm not getting any, and they're shading out a whole bunch of stuff. And since I have started cutting some of them out, the gooseberries have been able to produce a lot more things. Hazelnuts have been able to get more nuts on them. So it's really kind of helped me expand some of my yielding growing area. So that's, yeah, what was that?
It's the nettle patch and the bee balm patch. And
Right.
the other one had like really taken off because
So they're still, like all those things still have some shade. So they're a little cooler than out in the middle of a sunny field. That's the other thing I really like about forest gardening. Like this time of the year, there's the shade in my forest gardens is there now. And it's so much cooler. And I go out and I tie up tomatoes and I'm just like dripping. I'm like condensating.
Break a
And,
sweat.
So some of the fun things, like on that regard of creating shade for yourself too, is the, are you guys familiar with the term coppicing and pollarding?